Detective Clevens looked over the scene in shock. At least a dozen dead, bodies broken and twisted. One, a Gorvan, even had the broken blade of a small knife sticking from their chest carapace. The car of the bullet train was splattered with technicolor blood, and Clevens' talon covers were beginning to soak it up. He glanced over at the victim, a small Mousian girl who was tearfully receiving a medical checkup in a Medicraft. Despite there being 4 witnesses to the event, the story hadn't changed. His sharp eyes slowly turned to the lone, dark-skinned human in dirty, ragged clothing. An emergency medical technician was squeamishly watching as the man calmly stitched a long gash on his arm closed with a monofilament suture. He sighed and glanced at his partner. "Run me through it one more time." Officer Calv sighed deeply as well, making a stressed gurgling sound as he looked for his report, gesturing at an adolescent rallet with their throats split open. "Witnesses reported that these 14 individuals boarded the train being loud and boisterous. Our friend outside had been sitting alone in the back of the train car. There." He used a tentacle to point out a seat where a leather bag still sat, right next to the door that led into the next car. "Well, after about 2 stops, this one decided to try and assault our victim, the Mousian. Witnesses reported that the victim had repeatedly denied the perpetrator's advances when the perp decided to get physical. Ms. Lay stated that he had grabbed her by the collar. Our unknown..." He pointed to the man outside, who was now splinting his own broken fingers. "Reportedly stood up then and shouted, and I quote here, 'Get your grubby paws off her, she said no,' before pulling out a small folding pocket knife and pointing it at the group. It was then that our perpetrator decided to ignore our wildcard and try to assault Ms. Lave. Reports conflict slightly on what exactly happened next, but the most cohesive report from Ms. Lave herself states that our wildcard proceeded to rush the perpetrator. There was a struggle, and WC tore his throat open with the knife. The other perps then ganged up on our WC in an attempt to either subdue or kill him. That part is still unclear. Security footage only caught from this one." He gestures at a Zalaxian with blunt force trauma wounds and a missing head. WC had mopped up the Rallet, 2 Gorvon, and a Gegnosian before the camera could start recording. Calv pointed to where a handrail had been snapped off. The Zalaxian had ripped off a handrail to defend themselves, but our WC managed to disarm them and use the handrail to brutal effect. Before holding the Zalaxian's head out the window while the train was moving, we found it roughly a mile back along the tracks where it had gotten embedded in a tree growing near the tracks. After that, WC proceeded to beat the remaining perpetrators to death with the handrail after giving them a chance to surrender. Naturally, they continued to try and fight their way out of the situation. Cal finished his report with a deep, moist breath of disbelief. He waved a tentacle around in amazement before his 12 eyes focused on Detective Clevens. "He still hasn't said anything to me or the guys in the precinct, but we checked his ID. He was part of the 1st Terra Marines during the siege of Granator 6. Heard you also fought in that conflict, so we thought you might be able to get something out of him." Clevens nodded, softly, clicking his talons together as he turned on his heel toe. "I'll try. Terra Marines can be a tight-lipped bunch, but I know how to talk to them." Stepping out of the train car, Detective Clevens yanked off his body camera and audio recorder in full view of the man before calmly sitting across from him and pulling out a pack of cigarettes and a flask of whiskey. Taking a pull from the flask and lighting the cigarette, he offered the human a smoke and a drink. The Marine smiled softly and took a cigarette and the flask, taking a long pull from it before grinning softly. "Granitar corn whiskey. Some call it the worst in the galaxy. But in the trenches, it was like the gods' ambrosia." Clevens finished the old saying with a soft rustling of his neck feathers, the closest he could come to approximating a returned smile. The human looked back at the train car and asked, "Is she okay?" "Shaken up, but otherwise unharmed. Probably going to need therapy." The man sighed softly. "Guess I overdid it." Clevens shrugged softly Maybe. I'm more concerned about why you did it. You could have gotten yourself killed. The Marine looked up into Cleven's eyes, smile fading softly, as he smoked the cigarette pensively. As a Marine, my duty was to kill the enemy and protect my battle brothers. Clevens nodded, letting the man collect his thoughts. The Marine's eyes watching the small Mousian, as she received some sedatives to counteract the panic from the stressful situation. You were there on Granatar. I can see it in your eyes. Do you remember what it was like when we entered the city? Clevens paused for a long moment, accepting his flask back and taking a large pull. I do. Still have nightmares about sifting through the burn pits, finding those bones too small to be an adult's. I also remember finding the nobles holed up in their bunkers, fat as ticks. I remember not seeing what happened to them. The Marine nodded slightly and took a drag off their cigarette, 1,000-yard stare fixed on some point off in the distance. I did my duty as a soldier well that day, but I also did my duty as a human being just as well, if not better. His eyes grew a little misty as he looked back at the train car. Just like back then, I did my duty as a human today. He looked Clevens in the eyes before continuing, wiping tears away with his untorn sleeve. I couldn't protect them then, but I can and did protect her today. Whatever comes next doesn't matter. I did my duty. That is what matters. Detective Clevens nodded softly, before rising to his talons and patting the Marine on the shoulder, snapping a Terran salute. I'll put it in my report, but you should still expect a court summons in the coming weeks. The Metropolis is probably going to try and label you a vigilante still. Semper Fi, Marine. The Marine smiled softly and finished the cigarette, returning the salute before replying, Do or die. Detective Clevens picked up his body cam and audio recorder, leaving the Marine his flask as he headed for his vehicle. He hated paperwork, and there was going to be a lot of it to do when he got back to the office.